So, you guys really enjoyed the first look at some of wrestling's worst examples of nepotism. Therefore, in the words of the great intellectual and televisual genius Alan Partridge, people like them, let's make some more of them. You had a good few suggestions for other Nepo babies that would be worth covering, and I've taken them on board. Once again, the goal here isn't necessarily to dive straight into the most obvious examples that are kicking around, the David Flairs and whatnot, but to perhaps go a little deeper and find the real gems, or, well, the opposite of gems in this instance. And so here's 5 more examples of how wrestling, being such a family-oriented business, can produce some people who, well, aren't really cut out for the sport beyond having a famous name. Let's get on it. Our first entry was much requested, with some people even saying that they potentially could be a match for George Gulas. Those are some pretty big words, so naturally my curiosity is piqued. Is Angelo Mosca Jr. really that bad? Did he say anything like "Daddy said sell"? Did he have a collection of boogers above his bed? Did other wrestlers have to drive him hundreds of miles out of the way to his favourite burger restaurant for a picnic? Well, let's find out. The story of Angelo Mosca Jr. takes us to the arse end of the Territories era, to 1984 and the NWA. The business isn't in a good way, and the 47-year-old Angelo Mosca, a legend in Canadian football and a very successful wrestler, has been brought back into the fray, and he's talking a lot about how he's trained up his progeny to be a success in the ring. You can't exactly ignore Mosca when he's talking about this, as he is rather famous for having a very loud voice indeed. And so, Angelo Mosca Jr., who has a background in gridiron just like his dad, makes his debut in 1983. However, 1984 is very much going to be the year we're focusing on. He's going to be featured a lot, and he's going to win titles, but his performances are going to be... they're going to be disappointing. I should say, at first, that Angelo Mosca Jr. does at least look athletic, and that he looks like a wrestler. He's a little taller than his dad, and while he's not quite as bulky, he's got a bit of muscle on him and so forth. But oh boy, the matches that are kicking around with him in action are not good at all. In the main, there is perhaps his most famous moment. On the 25th of January 1984 on NWA Worldwide, Mosca Jr. beat Ivan Koloff to win the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title, which would essentially be the equivalent of winning a TV title level strap, and certainly not a bad achievement considering how decorated Koloff is. The match, on the other hand, bloody hell. Koloff has to carry Mosca Jr. through every single last bit of it. He's certainly trying, but his execution is utterly not there. There are a couple of really quite winsome moments. There's his drop kicks, which are just as bad as that one Eric Watts threw at Steve Williams, only he does them that way all the frickin' time. There's the complete massacring of an arm drag in which he falls on his arse. Absolutely worst of all, there's his attempt at a figure 4 leg lock, which is, without question, the worst execution of the move in wrestling history. Makes The Miz look like the Nature Boy. He basically does nothing except cross Ivan's legs a little bit, and you can literally see Koloff telling him to at least put his leg on top. Despite this rather lackluster offence, Koloff, to his credit, remains absolutely professional. Seriously, he doesn't just sell like his leg's been kicked out of his leg, he sells as if Mosca has torn the leg right out of his leg. Like, it's a great sell job. Koloff's giving this everything he's got. In the end, after 10 or so minutes, and in front of an absolutely shocked Gary Hart, Mosca Jr. hits a rather weak body press off the top rope, and, as unconvincing as it may have looked, it's enough, and he wins the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight crown, naturally celebrating with his father. Mosca Jr. held the Mid-Atlantic belt for 53 days before dropping it back to Koloff, but he would win it twice more in 1984, beating Koloff again for the belt on 22nd of April, losing it to and winning it back from the Masked Outlaw who, as it happens, is frickin' Dory Funk Jr., and then finally dropping it in August to Ron Bass. During this time he also won the NWA Canadian Heavyweight Championship from Koloff, a belt that only lasted a few years in its original form from 1978 to 1984, and was vacated a month after Mosca Jr. won it for reasons we'll get into shortly, but it is a belt that was largely held by his father, so there's a nice continuity there. Mosca's dad would be visible throughout his short career, He would manage him, tag with him, and cut promos with him, and that's just how it would be. There's no storyline with the son turning on the father or anything like that. Speaking of promos, you may wonder about Mosca Jr.'s skill there. Sadly, it's about as good as his wrestling. This one deer in the headlights promo kind of says it all. He and interviewer Johnny Weaver, a man who in his own right is not exactly Gordon Bloody Soley, are seemingly in a contest to fumble and flub as many words as they can, but Mosca Jr. takes it at a canter when he manages to call his opponent, the assassin, Jody.
But here it seems that book's been put aside, not just with Jody, the man in the mask and everyone.
As in Jody Hamilton, the assassin's real name. Dearie me. It's not good, is it? Anyway, Angelo Mosca Jr.'s career didn't last all that long, a lot of that having to do with the state of the territories. Maple Leaf Wrestling, the carrier of the Canadian heavyweight title he ended up holding, got bought by the WWF in July, and that belt got vacated. Mosca Jr. continues to wrestle for Jim Crockett at Mid-Atlantic for a few months, but he eventually briefly finds his way to the WWF alongside his father, only wrestling a few matches there, all of which were located in Canada. And that's kind of it, really. Mosca Jr. wrestled a few more times over the next couple of years, including on a couple of Mosca Mania shows that were promoted by his dad, but he retired from the ring completely in 1988. As to why he was pushed in the first place, well, there's not a whole lot of info out there. Jim Cornette has posited on his podcast that it may have been because George Scott had the book and that he wanted to do right by Mosca Sr., although it appears Scott would have been working for the WWF by this stage. Still, I can see that as the reason. Mosca Sr., a very successful wrestler indeed, comes back and his kid is part of the deal. Pretty generic, really. As for what happened next, well, Mosca Jr. left the wrestling life behind. However, there is an interview with him from 2021 with Slam Wrestling, conducted shortly after the passing of his father due to Alzheimer's at the age of 84. Mosca Jr. comes across as a lovely guy in said interview, sharing plenty of reminiscences about his dad, but also going a bit into his own history in the ring. He candidly admits that in the end, pro wrestling wasn't really for him. He didn't like the public eye all that much, and he didn't have the charisma of his father. Still, he says that wrestling gave him a couple of very good things. He spent a lot of time with his dad, and he met his wife. And in the grand scheme of things, that matters more than belts. As I say, he comes off as a thoroughly good bloke in this interview. In summary then, Mosca Jr. definitely fits the Wrestling Nepobaby bill, that much is absolutely true, and he is certainly way down the list when it comes to wrestling know-how. But is he worse than George Gulas? Nah, I don't think so. Hell, not even worse than Ted DiBiase Jr., as far as character goes anyway, if not wrestling. Up next, well, I think we've got to have a look at Horace, haven't we? That one was certainly requested plenty, and it's kind of different seeing as while most Nepo babies are sons and daughters, this one is more classed as a Nepo nephew, the nephew of Hulk Hogan. He fits the bill totally fine, seeing as the Hulkster definitely helped to get him a few gigs. He was briefly a WWF jobber in early 1993 as the Predator, did a tour in New Japan the same year as Axe Boulder, and then of course he got his biggest one in WCW from 1998 to 2000 as Horace, later Horace Hogan. Probably most notable for the strange promo in which his familial bond with Hollywood was revealed, that culminated in poor Horace getting bashed with a steel chair and stretched out, one of the many highlights of the legendary Hogan vs Warrior feud of the year. From there, well, he never did too much unless Hulk was involved, and he left with him after the Russo incident at Bash at the Beach 2000. He also got a developmental contract with WWE in 2002, presumably at Hogan's behest once again, but he never appeared on TV and was soon released, at which point his career ended and he went into construction. That's the short version, the one that covers the more notable things, the one that is mainly about a WCW one which, yes, was pretty bloody rubbish. Not that simply being rubbish made you stand out too much as a stinker in 1999 or 2000, and beyond his small part in the Hogan-Warrior feud, it's not as if Horace was even in the mid-card, let alone the main event. Still, the general consensus was that Horace only ever had a job because of Hogan. Mind you, the WCW business was so chaotic at this point that I am sure the almighty footballer Ali Dia could have walked in, claimed to be a famous wrestler, and ended up signing a big six-figure contract just to stay home. And of course, yeah, the Horace look in 1998 is kind of unfortunate. The bald head, the goatee, the vest, the jeans and all that. I mean, you can kind of see why Deadlock has dubbed him Scuffed Steve Austin. Now, as far as the Nepo nephew thing goes, there is perhaps one thing that should be mentioned, as it is a rare time that I would be inclined to go to bat for the Hulkster, purely from a personal point of view. I wouldn't blame him at all for doing right by Horace, considering that his nephew lost both his mother and father when he was still young, and in horrendous circumstances. Thinking of it that way, Hogan securing a big fat WCW-sized paycheck for Horace isn't at all a bad thing. None of this is really what I want to focus on though. I want to look more at Horace Boulder in Japan, where he has a particular honour, one that most wrestlers featured in a video like this never come close to achieving. He was in a 5-star match. The main event of FMW's 16th May 1992 card in Los Angeles, in front of over 8,000 people at the California State Gymnasium, is a 6-man war between Atsushi Onita, El Hijo del Santo and Tarzan Goto, taking on Horace Boulder, Negro Casas and Tim Patterson, the last of these fellows being one of WWF's regular enhancement talents. It's a strange lineup to say the least, but it got the top marks in the Observer. Big Man Melt said in his write-up that the fans' consensus was that it was 5 stars, and that was confirmed in a list a couple of issues later. Now obviously, we should highlight this bout a little, especially seeing as it will allow us to include a bit of actually good wrestling in this video. This match is FMW's take on a classic Lucha 2 out of 3 falls, 2 referees, 6-man, with traditional Lucha tag rules, and it's a chaotic yet glorious, ugly delicious type of affair. A lot of the first and second falls consist of 2 big things going on. You've got Onita, Goto, Horace and Patterson brawling all around the ring, while Santito and Casas don't really get involved in that. Instead, they're going against each other inside the squared circle. This is, of course, incredible. El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas are in their prime, they're 2 of the greatest wrestlers of all time, they have one of the greatest rivalries of all time, and seeing as the majority of the in-ring action involves them, well, it's no wonder the match got top marks. Whenever these 2 are at it, the way things flow, the utterly seamless movement, wonderful. Wrestling poetry. Santito and Casas is a wrestling combo from the gods. Watching all of their matches on a loop would be pretty close to wrestling heaven. On the other side of things, well, a lot of the brawling focuses on Horace and Onita, who do a perfectly fine job of taking each other all the way around the whole of the arena, walk and brawl. Not a whole lot in the way of moves, but it certainly heats up the place. Still, regardless of this being an FMW show, and Onita being FMW's top star or anything like that, this is in LA. So obviously the most over people here are Santo and Casas by a very long way. Santo in particular is at a godly level of overness, and happily the heat is big throughout. While Santo and Casas' interactions with the other 4 guys in the match are honestly kind of minimal, we get a couple of enjoyable moments from Onita and Goto. I like Goto's strange springboard headbutt things that he does on Horace, and he gets the first fall with an inverted mat slam on Patterson. The Rudos take control in the second fall, isolating Santo a fair bit and trying to get the fabled mask off, and while Santito does manage to rally briefly, Casas scores the pin on him for the second fall with his trademark La Magistral Cradle. The third fall generally sticks to Lewin and goes fine, with the Technicos ultimately rallying and winning the day. Onita hits Horace with a Tiger Slam, and that's enough to seal the deal. 2 falls to 1, in a total time of 17 minutes 21 seconds. It's a great watch, and one I would obviously recommend, basically just for Santo and Casas alone, because you should watch every single match of theirs that you can. As for our main subject, Horace, well, he did just fine. I mean, he was kind of out of the way brawling with Anita for a big chunk of it. He has very little bearing on why the match ended up getting the top marks, if any, but he had a role to play and he did it. In the main, if you're looking for anything that features Horace Balder and is possibly enjoyable, FMW is where you're going to want to go, seeing as he actually wrestled hundreds of matches there. He was there for years. He worked there way more than he ever worked in WCW. If you like FMW and if you like hardcore wrestling, you may end up getting a kick out of some of it. He's certainly not anything special at all, but he does the same sort of brawling and features in the same sort of death matches that folks like Super Leather, Bad Boy Hido, Mr. Poga and Mitsuhiro Matsunaga do. Also, he teamed a lot and often faced his cousin, that being the Gladiator, Mike Awesome. And no doubt there's going to be some fun stuff there too. Technical classics? Obviously not, but certainly fun stuff. Also, here, as far as the Nepo thing goes, well, the old Orange Goblin was surely not responsible for getting Horace work in FMW, of all places. Really, it was more about Horace and Awesome coming together as a package. They were always very close, right from their childhood days, being inspired more than anything by their uncle, and supporting each other in getting into wrestling from the get-go. In the end, is Horace one of the worst Nepo babies? I'm inclined to say no. Sure, his WCW work is pretty bloody awful, but aside from the cruiserweights, that's par for the course in that company back then. Everything was shit. There's certainly a lot more worth to his work in FMW, although admittedly that may depend on the sort of wrestling that you enjoy. That and, well, he is pretty private. Since retiring from the ring, he's totally out of the wrestling life. No shoot interviews, no social media, and really no outside anything to report whatsoever. So there's no down marks there. Is he good in the ring? No. Can he swing a steel chair, send crowds running through the bleachers, or chuck himself into barbed wire? Yes. And in the world of FMW, those were fine qualities to have. They would get you places. A few people wanted to see me dip into the world of Pro Res again, where we covered the exploits of Simon Inoki in the last video. Perhaps to cover someone who's more of an active wrestler. And well, okay. As mentioned previously, active Nepo baby wrestlers in ProRes are a bit thin on the ground. Mitsuo Momota was suggested, but I kind of have plans for him elsewhere. Daiichi Hashimoto? He did perhaps try to follow directly in his father Shinya's footsteps earlier in his career, but he's done totally fine on his own path in recent years, and besides, you can hardly count him anyway. Daiichi decided to become a pro wrestler after his legendary father passed away in 2005 when he was 13 years old. He has a famous surname, but he is not a Nepo baby. So I guess, seeing as LEONA Fujinami was suggested, he is perhaps one to look at, although not too brutally. I mean, LEONA Fujinami, the son of the legendary Tatsumi Fujinami, isn't someone who'd be anywhere near a list of all-time bad Nepo babies. Like, he's several levels up from the depths. But I guess that a little look at LEONA both highlights some of the goings-on you might find in ProRes outside of the bigger companies, and is also an example of how a more regulation, run-of-the-mill wrestler's son fares in the world of Japanese pro-graps. Does he fare as well, or get as many opportunities as the more typical American Nepo baby? Perhaps not. LEONA Fujinami, who actually has a sports background in golf, started out wrestling in 2013, and one look at his cage match profile quickly signals him out as a bit of a journeyman, someone who's done gigs here and there for many promotions, but hasn't ever really stuck in a single place for that long. Now, this isn't a bad thing, of course, it just means that he's a freelancer, and thus is free to take bookings anywhere. Just like any typical indie pro wrestler, that's the norm. But of course he does have a home promotion, and unsurprisingly that home is Tradition, Tatsumi Fujinami's own indie promotion, which originally started in 2006 under the name of Muga World Pro Wrestling, and is one of many promotions that you will largely find running shows in Tokyo at the almighty Korakuen Hall, with enough of a dedicated following to usually pull around 800 or so to the venue for each show. Naturally, LEONA has worked and continues to work at the majority of Tradition's shows, but you can find him all over the shop. He wrestles regularly, and it includes the odd appearance here and there for the bigger likes of New Japan, All Japan, Noah, DDT and so on. So is there anything particularly objectionable about Leona? No, not at all. Looking at him in the ring, he is a perfectly average wrestler in the rather typical pro-res form, and one who certainly looks the part, although one senses that where he is kind of his ceiling. Leona is only 32 years old, which is perhaps surprising. In many ways, he looks a lot older than he is. A sort of throwback, someone who comes from the old times when people who were 32 years old would be read as around 45 now. Is he anything special in the ring? Not hugely, but then really it would be unfair to say that he's got any kind of overpush. His dad may run tradition, but he hasn't actually won any titles in the company. His two honours to date are winning the 2023 Dragon Cup with Masakatsu Funaki, and winning Niigata Pro Wrestling's tag titles, which he did with his father. To be honest, if he's not paired with his father or another more established guy, his standing does seem to be in the upper mid-card of tradition. Not really the main event of the show, just outside of it. And he can also often be found doing a bit of post-match commentary on the highlights from Tradition's YouTube channel. He seems to have the position pretty much that his skills deserve, kind of right in the middle. So with all this in mind, I don't know. It would be hard to just take the case of LEONA Fujinami and say that it's typical of any son or daughter who'd follow their parents into the wrestling. That having a famous father doesn't necessarily give you a whole lot in the way of benefits even when they're in charge, not in the way that someone like Eric Watts or George Gulas benefited. I mean, there's not even really enough examples kicking around to do that. In every other regard, aside from LEONA Fujinami wrestling in Japan, as opposed to the States or Mexico, he's not someone who'd come even remotely close to a list like this, seeing as he is, in every regard, thoroughly acceptable. Totally mediocre in the ring, totally mediocre in looks, seems a nice enough fellow. If he was overpushed you would probably get annoyed, but he isn't really. He's just a mid-carder in his legendary father's indie promotion. If folks like Kenta Kobashi, Riki Chosu, Genichiro Tenryu and Chigusa Nagaya or whoever had a son or daughter that followed them into the business, and was in their own promotions, things like Riki Pro, Tenryu Project, Marvelous, there's a decent chance that they may end up like LEONA Fujinami, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It simply means that legendary skills don't automatically pass down to the next generation. And what Leona has with his skill, build and so forth is still enough for the journeyman's career in the biz. At 32 there's still time for it to become more than that, but the chances obviously go down as the years go by. Leona may not have the same level of skill as his father, but he's not bad. And well, that's it. We should now perhaps get back to other wrestlers who may actually deserve this more. For our next foray into the vaults, we're going to need something to help us out. We're going to need some PP. Now what's that, you ask? A power pill? Something that once belonged to Val Venus? No, neither of those things. We need some Polish power. Yes, it's time for Scott Putski. Putski is another Nepo baby who is a little bit like Horace, although perhaps not hated on quite as much. Someone with pretty unimpressive wrestling skills who has still managed to do some curious things, including something which I have been waiting ages to find an opportunity to stick into a video, and finally, by covering Scott Putski, I get a chance to do it. We'll get to that a bit later on. Most people would probably also say that Scott Putski was, in actual fact, a better wrestler than his father, Ivan Putski was. Ivan, while certainly over in the old WWF days, wasn't exactly a technical wizard, let's just put it that way. Scott was, well, he could at least go a little bit, although not enough to really stick out. But as I say, we do have some interesting things to look at, so let's go. The WWF and WCW stuff should come first, seeing as, well, it's actually kind of brief. The 30-year-old Scott had already been wrestling for over a decade by the time he made his TV debut in WWF in May 1997, which was actually his second one in the company. He'd done a few dark matches in previous years. Scott was to be part of the new light heavyweight division, and his first TV bout was against Leif Cassidy, who is, of course, Al Snow. It's a rather lame match in front of a completely heatless Delaware crowd, one where Scott's heritage is naturally talked up, Obviously, good old JR's got a whole book of notes on his college football background, and the match kind of falls apart in places, with some definite miscommunications and flubs. The match's best moment is an actually quite cool jumping Wydeen bomb from Al Snow, but Putski wins with a really bloody nasty release German suplex, spiking the hell out of the New Rocker in, I don't know, again, a rather awkward way. It's a bit too Kins Road for 1997 WWF. To be honest, Scott Putski being billed as a light heavyweight is a pretty awkward thing in its own right, because he quite clearly is not one. He's a 250-pound guy at least. If Scott Putski is Vinnie Mac's idea of a light heavyweight, then his views on wrestling bodies are even more screwed up than we originally thought they were. Scott Putski's got the whopping muscles, he's got the big long hair. Hell, chuck some tassels on his arms and he'd honestly make for a pretty convincing Ultimate Warrior tribute. In the words of Jim Royal, light heavyweight my arse. Anyway, Jerry Lawler is naturally quite negative about Scott on commentary, and his first and only proper feud is a pretty obvious one. Scott Putski takes on fellow light heavyweight and second generation star, Brian Christopher. Indeed, a July 14th match on Raw sees the generations collide, Brian Christopher and the Kin taking on Scott and the 56-year-old Ivan, who still looks utterly chiselled, like a statue fresh out of the Velichka salt mines near his native Krakow. This is a lot better actually. We're in the Putskis' home state of Texas and therefore we have heat. They get an absolute hero's welcome from the San Antonio crowd, who absolutely lap up the appearance of Ivan, bad singing and all, and the younger Putski does at least do a couple of neat moves, faring a lot better here than he did on his debut against Leif Cassidy. He plays face in peril and should have been pinned after a Jerry Lawler piledriver, but Brian insists on finishing the match, promptly missing the hip-hop drop. Ivan eventually gets the hot tag, and he's in no business to mess about. Both Lawlers get the old Stone Age xylophone treatment, and Ivan quickly pins Jerry after the Polish hammer. Not bad at all, especially with the crowd actually going wild. However, it would all be over soon after that, in kind of nasty fashion. Scott would face Brian in a singles match on the 9th of September at In Your House Ground Zero, and after just a couple of minutes, a dive from Brian onto Scott goes badly wrong, and Scott Putski tears his quad hideously when trying to save it, to the point where his kneecap is not exactly in the right place anymore. It's really not nice, and Scott Putski wouldn't wrestle for 7 months following this match. And of course, by the time he was able to return, he was long gone from the WWF. From there, we get to WCW, where Scott wrestled 37 matches from 1998 to 1999. They include being a part of the long list of Goldberg victims and a TV title shot against Chris Jericho, but generally Putski's getting beat in short order through his run, with no real story to speak of. His last match in WCW was a loss to Scotty Riggs on August 31st, 99. Like, he is barely above the level of enhancement talent. Now, considering what we've already said about WCW, how much do you think Scott Putski got paid for his WCW run? Well, we don't know an exact amount, but as with everyone else, Scott got a check every 2 weeks regardless of what he did with the company, and it was damn good money. He said on shoot interviews that it was, by a long distance, the best money he ever earned in his wrestling career because, well, they were just giving it away. We kinda know that already from the many other beneficiaries of WCW being exceptionally generous with the poor when it comes to Ted Turner's cash, and Scott Putski is but another one of those utterly unfortunate souls who got paid a shitload to work like a few short matches every month. Again, to stress it, and no offence to Scott, but even someone of his pretty minor standing was still getting paid a ton by WCW. And hey, good on him for securing the bag. All of this paints a pretty average picture. Again, someone who is mediocre in the main. Not much drama to report either. Scott Putski was helped to get in by his father, who he thoroughly enjoyed working with, which is cool. No fallouts here or anything, nothing David Sammartino-esque. He was mostly done after the 90s, aside from a few bouts here and there, with his last match in 2014, and that's that. except for the actually really cool Finn, which comes before all the WWF and WCW stuff we talked about. It's 1994, we're in Japan, and specifically we're in Wrestle Association R, Wrestle and Romance, War. It's Tenryu's promotion, and they fought up possibly the strangest wrestling trio ever. Scott Putski, the Warlord, and frickin' Bob Backlund. What on earth? Now, I have mentioned this trio before when I previously covered Backlund's strange antics in Japan, Battle Arts, UWF and all that, but I did not have footage of it. However, not long after that video, the man, the legend, the Maffew of Botchamania, reached out and he provided, because he's awesome. And now, at long last, I can show this incredible trio in action. As always, a big thanks to Maffew for this. What you're seeing here is comprised of 2 matches, both against the same team. The almighty Backlund Warlord Putski trio defeated the Fuyuki-gun team of Hiromichi Fuyuki, Jado and Guido for War's 6-man straps on 26th of August, then lost it back to them a few days later on 1st of September. Both of these matches were main event bouts too. And they're really fun. The first one certainly is, as we can see that pretty much in full. The second one is clipped highlights. The Fuyuki-gun stable, which also included a young Chris Jericho at one point, are total heels and pretty great at it, so we've got lots of fun in that department. We have no commentary, but frankly we don't need it. Between Bob Backlund's "Whoa-row-row-rows" and Fuyuki's banshee howling, there's plenty going on in the vocal department. Although I also like how early in the match Warlord atomic throws Jado and shouts, "Don't try that!" like he's doing a vocal line for WWF Attitude on PS1.
Don't try that!
Anyway, everyone has their role to play, and Scott Putski, who accounts for himself pretty well, is mainly the face in peril. He does plenty of selling, which is good. Jado and Guido are thoroughly shit-eating bastards, Warlord does some okay power stuff, and Backlund and Fuyuki are the obvious highlights, especially when they go at each other. There's a hilarious moment at the end of the first match when, after Backlund's won the day and the straps by submitting Guido with the chicken win, they jawjack at each other and then stomp at each other, like they're doing a sort of ritual dance. The second match seems to follow much the same beats, but this time Putski gets totally isolated and Fuyuki submits him, again with the chicken win. All of this kind of builds up to a singles bout between Backlund and Fuyuki that, sadly, we do not see. Indeed, this tour actually culminates with Backlund and Tenryu taking on Fuyuki and Guido, which I'm sure would have been bloody great. The main thing I get from this is Backlund and Fuyuki working so damn well together, and wishing that there was more of them going at it. Anywho, it's cool to finally get this in a video, and Scott Putski with his long hair and, again, slightly warrior-esque look, didn't do too badly in it. It seems like a fine enough way to end our look at the Polish prince. It's not like, again, there's even much dirt to dish, beyond Missy Hyatt's comments on him in the bedroom, which, yeah, I couldn't care less about. Putski isn't exactly interesting, but he's quite inoffensive, unlike our final entry. A few people recommended that I take a dive into the world of Lucha Libre for a second video, which makes sense. Wrestling in Mexico is even more family oriented than it is in the States, constantly passed down through the generations. Still, who to focus on? A couple of people were specifically mentioned, such as Hijo del Signo, who seems to coast along at a certain level of success despite not being particularly talented in any way. I've heard very bad things about Santo Jr., the son of El Hijo del Santo. From what little I can find, he's not exactly got the same aura of his father, to say the least, but there's not much there. It doesn't seem like he wrestles much outside of cards that his dad's on, and, well, his dad's now retired. To be honest then, even if the guy I'm going with here is far from the worst wrestler, well, he's spectacularly overachieved considering that his general wrestling and promos and all that have never risen too far above good, and as a person, well, he's a complete and total piece of shit. It seems to me that as far as bad wrestling Nepobabies go, people really sleep on Dos Caras Jr., better known as Alberto Del Rio or Alberto El Patron, the son of Dos Caras, nephew of Mil Mascaras, And yet, well, I suppose this entry is kind of the equivalent to the one for Ted DiBiase Jr. in the previous video. Someone who does have skill, but is still utterly hideous to a point where I would rather watch anyone else mentioned in this video over him. Now, I have to almost begrudgingly state from the offset that as a wrestler, Alberto is okay. Skill-wise, he's a perfectly good technician. But that's kind of it, isn't it? I mean, it's not like he's Bret Hart. No one is going to be looking back and pining for the glory days of Alberto Del Rio, surely. Honestly, I just associate him with an endless set of completely middling WWE matches against folks like Dolph Ziggler, John Morrison, Rey Mysterio, Dolph Ziggler, Sheamus, Christian, Randy Orton, and of course, Dolph Bloody Ziggler. I don't know about you, but forget about watching Class A rubbish like Heroes of Wrestling and whatnot. My idea of a wrestling hell would be being forced to watch every single Del Rio and Dolph Ziggler match on a loop. Now, poor old Ziggler is taking a lot of live rounds here just by association, but Christ, how many times did the WWE put those two together, and why didn't it stop? Anyway, I think you get the gist. Alberto Del Rio was not necessarily the sort of wrestler one looks forward to seeing on Raw and SmackDown every week. Frankly, the antics of Ricardo Rodriguez, his manager and ring announcer, were much more entertaining. And yet, well, geez, look at all the shit he won. 2 WWE titles, 2 World Heavyweight Championships, 2 US titles, a Money in the Bank, and the frickin' Royal Rumble. Many stories and gimmicks, of course, and yeah, most of them were garbage. Again, just this relentless barrage of mediocrity, of, well, let's just throw these guys together as we really don't have much for them to do, and they can just be a big monochrome slab of generic heel slop. I mean, who can forget about the almighty League of Nations team of Del Rio, Sheamus, Rusev, and Wade Barrett, the lads? I sure wish I could forget about it. How about the inexplicable and unfathomably stupid Mex America gimmick, where he got paired with Zeb Coulter, the one that's only really notable for ending John Cena's open US title reign? What the hell was that even about? No one knows. I doubt even Vince knew. It just came together like 2 drunk drivers in his addled mind. And really, outside of those particular lowlights, all you get character-wise from his lengthy run in the WWE is an inferior John Bradshaw Layfield, fancy car and all. Honestly, it's all just wallpaper paste. It's all vows. Useless, gutless vows. 8 bloody years in the WWE, and the only punch he threw with any real meaning was that one to some staffer who told a racist joke. He's a mascot for a bad era. The moment I think of Del Rio, my mind races towards heel Michael Cole, stand up for WWE, Raw guest hosts, an anonymous GM, and endless promos for Tout. And honestly, thinking about all that does not exactly improve my day. And then of course there's all the personal shit, the rather awful relationship between himself and Saraya, one that seems to go into really kind of bad places and probably ensures that Alberto would not exactly receive the warmest of welcomes from the Knight family if he ever decided to step foot into Norfolk again. There's been other investigations related to domestic violence, full-on charges in 2020 over an incident with his then girlfriend that were ultimately dropped, attacking fans right up as recently as 2025, plenty more bouts of dickery and violence. It's fair to say that he is not a particularly pleasant dude, and the constant bubble around him potentially making a return to WWE, God, what with the closeness between him and AAA, and the WWE now holding a 51% share in that company, does not exactly inspire any kind of confidence. It's not exactly something that would surprise me if it happened, and I'm not sure if it would piss me off so much as it would just make me wearily shake my head, as it's so bloody typical. While I can perhaps appreciate that, as far as skill level goes, Alberto Del Rio is far ahead of the other folks who get featured in a video like this one, yeah, as a person, he absolutely belongs. Fuck this guy. And that's wrapping up our second look at various wrestling Nepobabies. A bit of a deeper dive than the first, with some more interesting bits from various fellows' careers, particularly Horace and Scott Putski. Will there be a third? Well, never say never. I'm sure you'll have plenty more folks to suggest in the comments, of course, and I thoroughly welcome that. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.